In the twilight of his reign, Henry VIII was no longer a king, but a corpse that refused to die. Gone was the gallant young ruler who once jousted in shining armor, placed by a monstrous figure, grotesque in both body and spirit. He could no longer walk unaided. Entire mechanical contraptions were built just to move the sovereign from chamber to chamber, like an ancient machine carrying death on a throne. By the final years of his life, Henry had become a walking ruin, a man devoured by his own flesh, whose presence stank of decay and dread. His body had swelled into a mountain of rotting meat and corrupted majesty, tipping the scales at nearly 400 pounds, the waist that stretched 54 inches wide, wider than many men were tall in his time. These weren't minor wounds. They were open tombs on living limbs, never healing, forever oozing. The stench was unspeakable, thick and sour, like rot in a crypt. Courtiers would cover their faces with perfumed handkerchiefs just to survive the scent. Royal aides had to carry a custom-built chair part throne, part toilet wherever he went. This was a man consumed by his own decay, a monarch entombed in rotting flesh, a living symbol of the rot at the heart of absolute power. He left trails of waste and flesh, and behind him came men with cloths and buckets, cleaning the remains of a king who was already decomposing while alive. Henry VIII wasn't just a king, he was a warning, a monster in silk and gold, a terrifying reminder of what happens when unchecked power meets human fragility. It remembers his break from the Catholic Church. But what it often forgets is this. Some say the smell of his dying flesh reached through walls, announcing the king's arrival long before he entered the room. But the true horror lay beneath his robes. His legs were ravaged by gaping ulcers, festering sores that wept pus and dead flesh. In 1536, he suffered a catastrophic head injury in a jousting accident, knocked conscious for 2 hours, a death sentence by medieval standards. Modern medicine suggests he may have endured a traumatic brain injury, one that twisted his mind as surely as time ravaged his body. He grew paranoid, violent, unpredictable. The charming prince became a tyrant, cloaked in fear. It was so unbearable, so traumatic, that his attendants men sworn to serve their sovereign were forced to draw straws. Just to determine who would endure the punishment of dressing him, no one volunteered. To serve the king was to suffer beside him. Historians today believe that Henry's decline was not merely physical, but none dared tell the king. To question his health was to court death. Even his own physicians feared their lives more than they feared their patients' agony. Some believe he also suffered from Cushing's syndrome, a rare hormonal disorder that would explain his sudden obesity. His wild mood swings, and those horrific wounds that would never close. By the end, Henry couldn't control his own bowels. This was no longer the ruler of England, and yet he ruled. Even as his body betrayed him, even as his mind fractured and festered, he clung to the throne like a dying god refusing to fall. History remembers his 6 wives. By the end, England was ruled by a corpse sand. No one had the courage to say it out loud. History teaches us that King Henry VIII had 6 wives. It teaches us that 2 were executed. But the truth, the grotesque, gut-wrenching truth, is far more horrifying than a simple count of marriages and deaths. Behind the royal portraits and polished palace records lies a blood-soaked legacy of manipulation, betrayal, psychological torture, and state-sanctioned cruelty. These women weren't just queens, were prisoners of a monstrous king, Anne Boleyn. The framed Queen Anne Boleyn is remembered as the first queen to be beheaded. When he discovered her past denizen relationships from before the marriage, his reaction was not heartbreak. It was vengeance. He passed a new law, declaring it treason for anyone to marry the king without disclosing their full sexual history. Think about that. He rewrote the law of England out of spite, but her death was not a mere execution. It was an orchestrated horror show, a political murder wrapped in lies. A queen turned into a ghost within her own realm. But Henry wasn't satisfied with her death alone. He forced Anne to watch those 5 men executed first, one by one watching her brother die, knowing she was next. Jane died days after giving birth to Henry's only legitimate son. And what did the grieving king do? Began searching for a new wife just 9 days after her funeral. Jane's body was still warm in the tomb when Henry was already calculating his next conquest. This wasn't justice. This was revenge by theater, with an as the captive audience and her life as the final act. When Henry grew tired of her, he didn't simply cast her aside. No, he fabricated a scandal so vile it shook the court to its core. When Henry saw her in person after their political engagement, he deemed her unattractive and instantly sought to rid himself of her. But Anne was no fool. She signed the annulment, played the role of the grateful ex-wife, and lived the rest of her life in quiet comfort. Refusing to provoke a man who had already sent 2 wives to the scaffold, Anne was accused of adultery, not just with one man, but with 5, including her own brother. Tortured confessions were extracted, truths twisted into weapons. They were married for alliances, discarded for convenience, destroyed for ego. He wooed with promises, gifted crowns, and then ripped those crowns away, leaving heads to roll. Some died in terror, others in silence. And those who survived? They did so by erasing themselves completely, becoming shadows in Henry's blood-soaked court. Their wounds were national obsessions, their emotions were tools, their lives were currency, and their deaths entertainment for a king addicted to control. Catherine Howard, the child bride for years, she stood by him until she failed to give him a male heir. Her reward? Exile. Henry locked her away in isolation, forbade her from seeing her daughter, Princess Mary, and allowed rumors to spread that she was mad. Then came Catherine Howard, a mere teenager when Henry, then in his 50s and in full physical and mental decay, took her as his bride. And then he beheaded her, just as he had done to Anne. A child punished for the crime of not being pure enough for a man who was already a decaying shell of royalty. Catherine of Aragon. The forgotten wife before them all came Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first and most devoted queen. She died alone, likely poisoned, still writing letters to the husband who had long stopped reading them. Jane Seymour, the lucky one? Then came Jane Seymour, the woman often referred to as the lucky one, not because she lived, but because she died before Henry could destroy her. Anne of Cleves, the survivor Anne of Cleves, may be the only wife who truly escaped. She survived not by fighting, but by surrendering completely. Each of these women was treated as a pawn in Henry's twisted game of power and paranoia. This is not the tale of a monarch in love. It's the story of a tyrant who used marriage as a weapon. These weren't just queens, they were victims. And their stories are the true legacy of Henry VIII, the man who demanded loyalty and love, but returned nothing but suffering. He was not merely a king, he was a glutton crowned in gold, a man who devoured like a god but decayed like a beast. In an age when most people barely scraped together a few simple meals, the king feasted as if he were trying to starve the rest of England. But it wasn't just the amount, it was the spectacle. The dining habits of Henry VIII weren't just excessive, they were a performance of power, a ritual of indulgence so unhinged it bordered on the mythical. The royal kitchens weren't kitchens, they were industrial empires. Over 200 cooks, bakers, and staff worked day and night, crafting 800 separate dishes to serve the needs of Henry's court, with the king himself sampling dozens personally. This wasn't eating for nourishment. This was eating as domination. At his peak and especially in his decline, Henry consumed up to 5,000 calories per day. His daily meals featured whole roasted pigs, multiple chickens, platters of fish, endless mountains of bread, and enough red wine and ale to drown a village. But here's where the madness turns medieval. Henry believed that certain foods held mystical powers. To him, this wasn't a diet, it was sorcery on a silver platter. Swans were consumed for grace. Multiple servants would eat from his plate first, then wait 30 minutes in case the poison acted slowly, day after day, feast after feast. Convinced that royalty itself made him immune to consequence. Only when no one collapsed in agony would the king lift his fork. Commoners' food like turnips, onions, and barley was literally forbidden in the royal kitchens. But even as his body betrayed him, he would not relent. His appetite was a symbol of his divine right, a ritual of control in a world slipping through his fingers. Never mind that these humble ingredients were far healthier than the sugar-laced meats and buttery pies he devoured. To Henry, to eat like the people was to sink to their level. Kings do not stoop. His meals were theatrical, paranoid affairs conducted in full view of courtiers, lasting up to 4 hours. Each course was a ceremony, each swallow a declaration. I am too powerful to fall. Venison was devoured to make him a better hunter. And oysters, those he believed enhanced his performance in the royal bedchamber. He didn't eat to live. He ate to become more than human, to assert his dominance over nature, over flesh, over mortality itself. But with power comes fear, and Henry's fear ran deep. Every single bite that touched his lips had to be tested for poison. But Henry's paranoia didn't stop there. He banned entire categories of food from his court not because they were dangerous or unhealthy, but because he considered them beneath his status. Even as his body ballooned beyond recognition, as his legs rotted with open ulcers, as he could no longer walk without assistance, Henry kept eating. He was wrong. His gluttony led to infections, immobility, and decay, transforming him from a man into a monument of flesh, collapsing under its own weight. Henry's dining room was not a place of sustenance. It was a battlefield of ego, a temple of excess, a slow, royal suicide by silver spoon. By the final years of his reign, King Henry VIII no longer ruled with wisdom or strength, he ruled with fear. What began as a kingdom of faith and splendor transformed into a paranoid prison, where whispers could be deadly and shadows were not empty. But when it came, it swallowed everything: his court, his family, and even his own mind. His paranoia became law, suspicion became policy, and his fear, weaponized, became the invisible hand that choked an empire from within. They were listening. Henry's descent into madness wasn't sudden. It crept in slowly, fed by illness, betrayal, and unrelenting ego. A fortress of fear by night, Henry did not sleep like a king. He slept like prey. His bedchamber was a fortress. A loaded crossbow rested by his bedside, always within arm's reach. Daggers were hidden beneath his pillows, a final defense from imaginary assassins. Armed guards stood watch inside his room, not outside, watching him sleep like sentinels of dread. But it didn't end there. Spies to watch the other spies. It was a paranoia feedback loop, where no one knew who could be trusted. Because everyone was watching someone, and someone was always watching you. His palaces were labyrinths of secrecy, riddled with hidden passageways, peepholes carved into walls, and crude listening devices installed in council chambers. These weren't for luxury or escape, they were for spying, for catching whispers before they became rebellion. He believed they plotted against him not because of any evidence, but because his mind had become a palace of suspicion. The court of Henry VIII became a place where loyalty was measured in silence, and survival depended on being invisible. They were treated not as heirs, but as threats. Royal blood no longer offered protection, it invited scrutiny. The spies who watched the spies, Henry created a surveillance machine so vast and tangled that it began to devour itself. He employed spies to watch over his nobles, informants to watch his staff, and then, one wrong word, one misunderstood glance, and you could disappear into the Tower of London. Not for what you did, but for what the king feared you might do. Even blood wasn't safe, and once he believed you were disloyal, there was no defense, no appeal, no mercy. Not even his own children were spared. Henry ordered surveillance on Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters. Servants reported masters hoping to curry favor. Entire families vanished over rumors, fears, or imagined conspiracies. The Tower of London, once a fortress of state, became a revolving door of political victims executed not for rebellion, but for daring to exist too close to the king's paranoia. Henry didn't just destroy his enemies, he unmade their sense of reality. Courtiers lived in terror. Friends betrayed friends. Servants whispered through locked doors. Dreams that killed. Perhaps most terrifying of all, Henry began to execute people, not for crimes committed, but for crimes imagined. There are recorded cases of men and women being arrested and sentenced to death because they had a dream where the king died. Someone claimed they had a bad feeling about them. They looked nervous in the king's presence. He ruled not with sword or scepter, but with silence, suspicion, and fear. In Henry's world, guilt was not proven, it was assumed, the court of shadows. The longer Henry ruled, the darker the court became. Nobles spied on one another, hoping to out the other first. The man who once dazzled Europe with his charm and power had become a tyrant, ruled by ghosts, hunted by imaginary enemies, and held hostage by the very fear he spread. A kingdom held hostage by a mind in decay. This was not just political control. It was psychological domination, a web so thick that even those closest to the king began to doubt their own thoughts. He didn't trust his friends. He didn't trust his lovers. He didn't even trust his own blood. So as his body rotted and his mind fractured, Henry VIII turned the most powerful kingdom in Europe into a stage for his nightmares. A king who feared shadows more than armies. A king whose crown grew heavier with every whisper. A king who could not sleep unless someone was watching him breathe. Most kings go to the grave with dignity. Henry VIII did not. His death was not a peaceful passing, but the final act in a horror story written by disease, gluttony, and decay. And even as his heart stopped, the chaos he left behind kept breathing. By the end of his life, Henry was a carcass, carried on a throne. But to clean up the pieces of him that were dying faster than he was, his body, consumed by necrosis, was literally falling apart. Massive ulcers infected his legs, and as he moved hoisted by ropes and wheeled chairs like a decaying statue, chunks of his flesh broke off, hitting the palace floor with wet slaps. Servants were assigned to follow him, cloths and rags in hand. Not to honor the king, death was not the end. It was the beginning. When Henry finally died in 1547, England may have sighed in relief, but his body had other plans. Already bloated from disease and rot, his corpse began to swell grotesquely, filled with gases from unchecked decomposition. Physicians, too terrified to challenge him in life, now refused to touch him in death. To keep his body from leaking, the royal embalmers wrapped him in lead sheets, sealed him in multiple layers of wooden coffins, and prayed it would hold. It didn't. The smell was so overpowering that the procession had to stop, and horrified servants scrambled to scoop up the spilled remains with buckets and rags. The king, who claimed divine right, was reduced to roadkill. A king who had ruled with an iron fist now sank into the mud, pulled under by the same gravity he once thought himself above. The coffin that exploded, they dug it twice as wide, but still the ground kept collapsing under the weight of the lead-lined coffin and the decomposing. Moss within, groaning, bubbling. The unmistakable scent of death leaking from the stone. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor, the unthinkable happened. The pressure inside his coffin grew. It grew. And then it exploded. The tomb was not a resting place. It was a pressure cooker of royal decay. The lead casing burst open, unleashing a wave of decomposing royal flesh and gas into the hearse. In life, he ruled through fear. In death, he killed with rot. Witnesses claimed that wild dogs followed the trail, drawn by the stench, and some were reportedly seen licking the human remains off the road. A grave fit for a monster when they reached Windsor. Another problem arose. Henry's body was too large for a normal grave. It took multiple attempts to bury him, as the soil caved in again and again, as if the earth itself was rejecting what had been given to it. It's found in the stench of a king who refused to decay in silence, who left ruin and fear in his wake even after his heart stopped beating. The curse that lingered, but even that wasn't the end. For weeks, some say months, after Henry was finally buried, strange sounds were reported near the tomb. While some whispered of ghosts, historians now believe it was simply more gases escaping from his still rotting body. And the terror spread beyond the grave. Several of the servants who handled Henry's corpse fell ill and died shortly afterward, likely from infections caused by prolonged exposure to the king's toxic remains. The rotting legacy, this was not just the death of a king. It was the final unraveling of a man who thought himself immortal. It's undone by the very body he had used to dominate his wives, his court, and his kingdom. He believed in divine right, believed his bloodline was chosen, but in the end, his corpse exploded on a country road. The true legacy of Henry VIII is not only found in political reforms or church schisms. He was a tyrant in life, a nightmare in death, and a rotting monument to the darkness of absolute power. When history speaks of Henry VIII, it often whispers the easy version: the king who defied the Pope, the man who founded the Church of England, the ruler with 6 wives and a mighty crown. But these are surface truths, a polished mask placed over a decaying face. Because Henry's true legacy is not one of faith or reform. It is not about religion, law, or royal lineage. It is about the monstrous transformation that happens when a man is given too much power and nothing to contain it. The birth of a tyrant Henry began his reign with promise. Charismatic, educated, handsome, a Renaissance prince. But power, like poison, works slowly. It does not scream at whispers, turning admiration into entitlement, and entitlement into obsession. Over the decades, Henry VIII devoured everything that tethered him to humanity. He silenced truth, rewrote the law, treated wives like possessions to be discarded or destroyed, turned his court into a maze of fear, twisted his kingdom into a machine built to protect a single man's delusion of immortality. A body is a mirror of a kingdom. As the years wore on, his body became a reflection of his reign, bloated, rotting, and dangerous. His leg wounds never healed. His flesh decayed while he lived, mind turned inward, gnawed by paranoia and madness. He couldn't walk. He couldn't sleep without weapons. He couldn't trust his own daughters. And yet none dared speak the truth, because to speak it meant death. This was not just physical decay. It was moral collapse, dressed in silk and fed with golden spoons. Death could not bury the monster even in death. Henry's horror continued. His coffin exploded, spraying rotting royal remains across the road. Dogs licked the remains of a man once called God's anointed. Gravediggers couldn't hold his weight. And the tomb he was sealed in reportedly leaked gas, stench, and sickness for weeks afterward. Servants died. Witnesses were traumatized. The king's final gift to his people was terror from beyond the grave. No saint, no savior, just a corpse too swollen with corruption to stay buried. The real church he built, he may have founded the Church of England, but what did he really build? Not a temple of faith, but a cathedral of fear. System where betrayal was imagined, love was a trap, and loyalty meant silence. In Henry's world, power replaced God, and that power demanded bloodwives, servants, friends, even his own. He ruled not through vision, but through paranoia, through hunger, through pain. And in the end, he ruled nothing, not even his own flesh. A caution carved in history. The legacy of Henry VIII is not written in scripture. It is written in the screams of the Tower, in the blood of queens, in the silence of those too afraid to speak. He is not a chapter in a textbook. He is a warning in flesh and bone. This is what happens when no one can say no to a king. This is what happens when a crown becomes a mask, hiding the rot underneath. This is what happens when a man, once loved, believes he is untouchable and becomes monstrous instead. Power unchecked devours, so remember him not as the founder of a church or the lover of 6 wives. Remember him as he truly was. A man who lost his soul in pursuit of control. A king whose greatest conquest was himself. A legacy not of glory, but of decay, madness, and fear. Henry VIII did not just die, he unraveled. History has never stopped bleeding from it.